In the summer of 1944, German prisoners of war kept saying the same thing to American intelligence officers. They said it in different words, in different tense, across different sectors of the front. But the meaning never changed. We were not seen, not the Americans missed, not we were unlucky. We were not seen, and we died anyway. This is the story of a camouflage system that slaughtered the British Army for 2 months in the hedgerows of Normandy, and why it became powerless against the farm boys from Iowa and the mill workers from Pennsylvania who arrived a few weeks later, carrying a different idea about how a man is supposed to be found on a battlefield. Normandy, July 1944. A hedgerow east of Saint-Lô. The morning fog has lifted an hour ago, but the light beneath the hawthorn canopy stays green and cold, filtered through leaves that have grown wild here since before Napoleon was born. The lane in front of the position is empty. The field beyond it is empty. Somewhere over the ridge, a farm cart moves along a road no one uses anymore. He is 22 years old, a paratrooper of the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division, and he has not moved in nearly 6 hours. His body is folded into the base of the embankment, pressed against damp earth that smells of root and iron. His helmet is wrapped in burlap and threaded with fresh vegetation cut before dawn. His face is smeared with the wet ash of last night's cooking fire. Around his shoulders and torso, a smock printed in a pattern the Waffen-SS field tested in 1937, cotton dyed in overlapping shapes that mimic the way sunlight falls through summer leaves. Green side out, the oak leaf pattern, Eichenlaubmuster. The garment has a name. The man wearing it does not, in any record we will ever recover. He has done everything he was trained to do. He has not shifted his weight. He has not scratched. He has not swallowed too loudly. The German camouflage doctrine that put him inside this smock spent 7 years teaching him one principle above all others. Stillness is the camouflage. The fabric matters. The training matters more. The human eye locks onto motion before it locks onto shape. And a man who does not move is a man who does not exist. He does not exist. The Americans, 3 fields to the west, cannot see him. They kill him anyway. The first 81mm mortar round detonates 10 feet above his position. The second, a heartbeat later, cracks through the branches to his left. The third finishes what the first 2 started. There has been no patrol down the lane. No scout has crested the ridge. No forward observer has raised a pair of binoculars from any elevation that overlooks this hedge. Nothing in the world outside his own concealment has changed in the last 6 hours except that now he is dead. His squad mate, 20 yards further along the embankment, survives long enough to be taken prisoner that afternoon. He is brought back to a 1st Army intelligence tent, where an officer asks him, through an interpreter, what happened. And the German paratrooper says something that will appear in dozens of interrogation reports filed across the American sector that summer, translated slightly differently by different clerks, but always meaning the same thing. We were not seen. Not, they missed the target. Not, we were unlucky. We were not seen. They found us without finding us. The concealment functioned exactly as designed, and we died regardless. In the weeks before, the identical camouflage system, printed on identical fabric, cut into identical smocks, worn by German soldiers trained in identical doctrine, had been killing British infantry at a catastrophic rate in the fields east of Caen. By the end of August, British and Canadian and Polish casualties in Normandy would climb past 83,000 men, 16,000 of them dead, most of them killed by weapons fired from positions no Allied soldier had ever visually located. The camouflage worked. The Germans were ghosts in the hedgerows, and the British paid for it in blood, field by field, hedge by hedge, for nearly 2 months. So how does the same system, worn by the same soldiers, defending the same terrain, stop working against a different army? The answer is not sharper American eyes. It is not better scouts. It is not superior camouflage doctrine. The Americans, by the standards of the German army in the summer of 1944, barely had a camouflage doctrine at all. What little they did have was abandoned within weeks for reasons that had nothing to do with its tactical merit. The answer begins in a classroom at an artillery school in Oklahoma, 15 years before D-Day. And it begins with a question no other army in 1944 had seriously asked. What if you didn't need to see the enemy at all to understand why that question mattered? You have to understand what the Germans had built. And to understand what they had built, you have to go to Munich in the spring of 1935. The man walking up the steps of the Academy of Fine Arts that morning is neither young nor famous. Johann Georg Otto Schick is somewhere in his 40s, a professor of textile and pattern design, an academic with soft hands and a soft voice, the last man on the continent anyone would expect to reshape the killing efficiency of a modern army. He has spent years studying something specific and obscure: how light moves through the canopy of a European forest, how the shadows of oak leaves shift between spring and autumn, which colors the human eye registers as a shape, and which colors the human eye reads as empty space between shapes. He is not looking for a war is looking for him. His visitor that day is an SS major named Wim Brandt, an engineer, a serious man in a black uniform. Brandt commands an SS Reconnaissance battalion, and he has spent the last year visiting textile chemists, print engineers, and industrial designers across the Reich, looking for something he cannot quite describe. Something better than the pattern the Reichswehr has been issuing since 1931. Splittertarn, splinter camouflage, hard-edged polygons of green and brown over a tan field, cut through with vertical green dashes meant to suggest falling rain, printed cheap and fast, adequate against the human eye at long range, and useless at anything closer. Brandt does not want adequate. He wants the pattern that ends the argument. Schick, the art professor, listens. And then Schick, the art professor, tells him something that 30 years of military engineers have somehow never quite articulated. The eye does not see fabric. The eye sees edges. The eye locks onto anything with a sharp boundary and a consistent shape, and it dismisses anything that has neither. If you want a soldier to disappear, you do not paint him the color of the forest. You paint him the shape of the light that falls through the forest. He begins to draw. Over the next 2 years, the patterns emerge from his studio one after another, each named for the light it imitates. Eichenlaubmuster, oak leaf. Platanenmuster, plane tree. Rauchsternmuster, blurred smoke. He designs the smocks reversible, green on one side for summer, brown on the other for autumn. So a single garment can serve a soldier across 2 seasons without any added cost to the factories printing the fabric. He files the patents in 1938. The SS Deutschland Regiment runs the field trials in 1937, controlled exercises comparing detection rates between soldiers wearing Schick's patterns and soldiers wearing standard field gray, observed by trained spotters at varying ranges and under varying light. The estimate that comes back to Brandt is a number that would define German camouflage policy for the rest of the decade. A 15% reduction in infantry casualties. By the time German paratroopers drop onto Crete in 1941, the Wehrmacht's elite formations are wearing what is by any honest technical measure the most advanced individual soldier camouflage system on Earth. No other major army will produce anything comparable until well after the war has ended. Not the British, not the Soviets, not the Americans, especially not the Americans. And now, in June of 1944, the system arrives in the terrain it was almost supernaturally suited to fight in. The bocage of Normandy is not landscape, it is architecture. Earthen banks 6 feet high, topped with hawthorn and bramble grown so thick that a man cannot see through them from 3 feet away, laid out in a maze of small fields 40 to 200 yards across. Sunken lanes cut so deep between the banks that a tank can drive down one and vanish from aerial photography entirely. This terrain has existed since the Roman occupation. The roots holding those banks together are older than most European nation-states. A Scottish reconnaissance officer, writing afterward of the fighting, will describe seeing or suspecting danger in every blade of grass. The German soldier in the hedgerow north of Caen, the Panzer Grenadier of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend wearing Schick's oak leaf smock has not simply crouched behind a bush. He has tunneled into the bank itself, beneath the root system, in a position engineered by German pioneer units, weeks before any British soldier reached this coast. He can fire from either side of the embankment without repositioning. His muzzle flash disappears into shadow. His shell casings fall into a hole he dug for them so they will not glint in the sun. The Imperial War Museum's own account of the fighting will describe British infantry advancing against what it calls, without qualification, an almost invisible enemy. The invisibility has a price, and the price is measured in a currency that does not round. 24,698 British casualties by the 30th of June. More than 46,000 by the 25th of July. Mortar fire from tubes positioned 3,000 to 4,000 yards behind the German front, directed by observers the British infantry never located, accounts for roughly 3/4 of those losses. The system is elegant in its economy. A thin screen of camouflaged forward positions on every hedgerow crest exists not to win the firefight. It exists to identify where the British are, to feed coordinates back to mortar and rocket batteries that do the actual killing from a distance no rifleman can reach. No Allied camouflage program of the period comes close to Schick's work. British and Canadian troops fight in plain khaki battle dress, with only scattered improvised foliage and specialist denizen smocks for snipers. Standardized, mass-produced, terrain-specific camouflage is a German monopoly. And in the Bocage, within the specific contest of British doctrine against German concealment, judged purely on its own terms, the Germans are winning decisively and repeatedly for the better part of 2 months. This is the fact the popular memory of the campaign does not quite know what to do with, because the larger war is being won at the same time on a different sector, by an army fighting a different kind of fight. The army that is about to arrive in the Bocage from the American sector to the west has not solved the camouflage problem. It has not tried to solve the camouflage problem. It has spent the last 15 years in a handful of underfunded institutions scattered across Georgia and Oklahoma, quietly working on a different problem entirely. A problem that will make the camouflage problem stop mattering. The German paratrooper in the hedgerow east of Saint-Lô does not know any of this. He has been trained inside a framework so internally coherent, so mathematically clean, that it does not contain the possibility of what is about to happen to him. In his framework, invisibility is survival. If undetected, then unharmed. His smock is the technical culmination of 7 years of research. The professor in Munich is still alive. The patterns are patented. The doctrine is written. Every part of the system that should have kept him breathing is functioning exactly as designed. He has done everything right. He is going to die anyway. And somewhere 3 fields to the west, without ever having seen him, without ever having suspected the specific bank he is buried inside, an American forward observer is looking at a map, reading off a 6-digit grid coordinate into a field radio, and asking for time on target. Villers-Bocage, the 13th of June, 1944, 1 week after D-Day. The main street of the town runs narrow between old stone walls, barely wide enough for 2 vehicles to pass. The British 7th Armored Division is moving through it. The Desert Rats, veterans of El Alamein and Tobruk, an armored column stretched out along the road, with tanks and half-tracks and reconnaissance carriers rolling nose to tail because there is no room to do anything else. They are attempting to outflank the German defenses around Caen. They are moving with the confidence of an army that has done this before, on ground, where doing this before actually meant something. SS Hauptsturmführer Michael Wittmann is 30 years old. He commands a Tiger tank that has become separated from the rest of his company. He is sitting in a concealed position beside the road, watching a British armored division walk into his gun. He engages at close range. 15 minutes. More than 12 British vehicles destroyed or disabled. The lead tank goes first, and then the last tank, and then everything trapped between them with no room to turn and no angle to return fire that will penetrate the Tiger's frontal armor. The Desert Rats, veterans of 3 years of mobile warfare in North Africa, are shot to pieces by a single man in a single vehicle they never saw. Wittmann's tactical brilliance is real, but it is not the reason the column was vulnerable. The column was vulnerable because British armored doctrine assumed that an approaching force could expect early warning, visual contact at distances measured in hundreds or thousands of yards, time to deploy into a fighting formation before contact. The Bocage offered none of that warning. A single well-concealed tank applying the same camouflage principle that hid the infantry in the hedges, scaled up to 60 tons of steel. That is what killed the 7th Armored's lead column that afternoon. Nothing in the British formation located the threat until the threat's first round was already in flight. Lieutenant General Guy Simons is 41 years old, Canadian, a career soldier. He commands 2 Canadian Corps, and he is one of the most technically capable Commonwealth officers of the war. Oh, his doctrine is called bite and hold. Oh, it was refined against Rommel in the desert, built around a rolling artillery barrage, followed by infantry advancing in disciplined fire and movement against a positively identified objective. In the western desert, where visibility could reach a mile in any direction, it worked. In the Bocage, visibility is 15 yards. The doctrine's core assumption that reconnaissance can locate the enemy before the attack begins does not transfer. British officers who fought at El Alamein find themselves applying methods calibrated for open country to terrain where a man in an oak leaf smock is invisible at 10 paces. The bite is delivered. There is nothing to hold because the enemy was never where the map said he was. And the enemy who killed you is still somewhere you cannot see. The British are not undertrained. They are not undermotivated. They are playing a game whose rules the Germans have written and mastered. And they are losing hedge by hedge, week after week. Now travel backward in time. 15 years, 4,000 miles. Fort Sill, Oklahoma, 1931. The heat coming off the artillery range in waves. 2 American officers in shirt sleeves standing beside a wooden observation tower running a demonstration that most of the visiting office watching them will politely forget by dinner. Major Carlos Brewer, Major Orlando Ward, both career artillerymen, both working on threadbare budgets in an interwar army ranked 17th in the world by size, smaller than the Army of Romania. They are proposing something the artillery world considers, at best, an academic curiosity. A single coordinating center. One room. Multiple batteries feeding it data. And any forward observer with a radio, anywhere within range, able to call down the concentrated fire of every gun the system controls onto one map square within minutes. The demonstration is met with something close to institutional indifference. The radios are heavy and unreliable. The mathematics, however elegant, seem to solve a problem no one has asked them to solve. Carlos Brewer will die before the war begins. He will never see what his idea does in combat. Fort Benning, Georgia. The same interwar decade. American infantry doctrine is absorbing a lesson from the Army's own studies of the First World War. In modern combat, the enemy is mostly invisible. He is in a trench, a hedge, a building. Most infantry fire on both sides is directed at suspected rather than confirmed positions, and the rounds that kill are simply the ones that happen to land where an enemy actually is. 2 decisions follow. The first is the M1 Garand, adopted 1936, the only semi-automatic standard-issue infantry rifle fielded by any major combatant in the war. A trained American rifleman fires 24 aimed rounds per minute. His British counterpart, with a Lee Enfield, fires 15. The German, with a carabiner 98K, fires less. Scaled to the squad, 12 Americans put roughly 300 rounds a minute into any hedge that looks suspicious. A comparable British section puts down half that. The second decision is doctrinal. The Army gives it a clinical name: Reconnaissance by fire. The manual instructs soldiers to fire on likely enemy positions, specifically to provoke a response that will confirm the enemy's presence and location. Nobody at Fort Benning has ever heard of Otto Schick. Nobody at Fort Sill is thinking about oak leaf smocks. The doctrine only asks where the enemy might be. And then it fires anyway. Hill 192, outside Saint-Lô, early July 1944. The 2nd Infantry Division of the United States Army is attempting to take a piece of ground the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division has fortified with everything Otto Schick's textile chemists ever printed. Every hedgerow crest is a firing position. Every sunken lane is a fire lane. The paratroopers are dug in beneath root systems, invisible at any range that matters. The American forward observers do not attempt to find them. Instead, they read grid coordinates off a map. They speak into radios, and they call for time on target. As many as 20 missions in a single night against a sector barely 2 miles wide. Between 100 and 300 shells from 105 millimeter and 155 millimeter howitzers arriving inside a single grid square within 5 to 7 minutes of the request. German artillery doctrine, by comparison, requires pre-plotted survey positions and deliberate calculation. An unexpected threat from an unanticipated direction takes 10 to 15 minutes before the German guns can respond at all. And that response still requires the kind of direct observation the entire German system is built around. The Americans have removed observation from the sequence. Aerial photographs of Hill 192 in the days before the assaults show terrain that observers describe as resembling a moth-eaten blanket. Hedgerows and tree lines pockmarked and consumed by repeated saturation fire. The paratroopers are still there. They are still wearing Schick's patterns. Their concealment is still intact by any measurement the German doctrine recognizes as meaningful. The concealment has simply become irrelevant because it is a property of the individual body, and the shells are not aimed at bodies. The shells are aimed at the grid square the bodies happen to occupy. On the 11th of July, 1944, the 2nd Infantry Division takes Hill 192. Across the fighting for that single position, the division loses 594 men killed, roughly 3,000 wounded. When the American infantry finally walks the ground the Germans held, they find the paratroopers of the 3rd Fallschirmjäger still in their fighting positions, still in their oak leaf smocks, still, in the strict sense of the word, invisible, killed by an enemy that in many documented cases had never visually located them at all. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, 52 years old, one of the most respected practitioners of mobile warfare in the German officer corps, writes to the German High Command in the weeks before an Allied fighter shreds his staff car and ends his active command. His assessment is the clean, professional judgment of a man who understands exactly what is killing his soldiers. Their great superiority in artillery, he writes, and an outstandingly large supply of ammunition. He does not write about American marksmanship. He does not write about American camouflage. He writes about a system, And he notes, in the private correspondence of a man who has spent his career studying systems, that the German army has no comparable answer to it. He does not yet know that the worst part of the system has not even arrived at the front. December 1944. The Ardennes. Snow on the pine forests. Snow on the roads. Snow on the wreckage of American vehicles pushed off the shoulders by a German offensive nobody in Allied intelligence had thought possible 3 weeks earlier. The line has cracked. Bastogne is surrounded, and in a headquarters far behind that line, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, 54 years old, Supreme Commander of Allied Expeditionary Forces, is signing a request that has been sitting on his desk for nearly 2 years. He is authorizing the ground use of the proximity fuse. The device has a code name, VT, Variable Time. It has been developed by an organization called Section T of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, a program that has quietly consumed roughly 3% of all American physicists working during the war. The Navy has guarded it with a secrecy comparable to the atomic bomb project. For 2.5 years, it has been reserved almost exclusively for anti-aircraft use over water, where any dud round falls into the ocean and vanishes forever. The fear was always the same. If an unexploded shell falls onto German soil, German engineers will reverse engineer it, and the Wehrmacht will have proximity-fused artillery of its own by the following spring. By December 1944, that calculation no longer holds. German industry is being bombed into ruin. German factories cannot deliver what German engineers might design. Eisenhower's request is a professional judgment that the war is ending soon enough that the secret is safe. The authorization comes back within 48 hours. By the end of the month, hundreds of thousands of VT-fused rounds are being loaded into American howitzers across the front. The engineering inside the shell is close to miraculous. A miniature radio transmitter built into the nose. It broadcasts continuously as the round flies, listens for its own signal reflecting back off the ground below, and detonates automatically at an optimal altitude, 30 to 50 feet above the target. The electronics survive being fired from a cannon at 20,000 times the force of gravity, spinning at tens of thousands of revolutions per minute. German ordnance engineers looked at this problem earlier in the war. They ran the calculations. They studied the vacuum tube technology available to them. And they concluded in a formal technical assessment that the problem was not solvable. They were wrong. The assessment was not unreasonable given what German laboratories had managed to test. But it meant that German forces would go into the last winter of the war with no defensive countermeasure for a weapon their own scientific establishment had concluded should not exist. For the man in the hedgerow, this is the end of everything. The geometry that had protected a concealed rifleman since 1914 was simple. Fragments from a ground impact shell travel outward and upward. A man flat against the earth, hidden in brush or a shallow hole, is often protected by nothing more than the fact that the metal is moving away from him. The VT fuse inverts the geometry entirely. The shell detonates above him. The fragments come down onto him, onto his back, onto his shoulders, onto the top of his helmet and the exposed line of his neck. No posture changes the physics. No hedgerow changes the physics. No smock changes the physics. The most sophisticated dappled foliage pattern Otto Schick ever designed is now a piece of printed cotton on a body that is being killed from directly overhead. In the Hürtgen forest, an American barrage using the new fuses catches a German patrol on the move between positions. When American soldiers walk the ground afterward, they find 96 bodies, every one of them still in a concealed position when the fire came down. Every one of them dressed in Wehrmacht camouflage. The chief ordnance officer of the European theater files a report describing the condition of the dead in a phrase that requires no exaggeration. They had gone through a meat grinder. General George Patton, 59 years old, is not a man given to crediting equipment over soldiers as a rule. In a memorandum written shortly after the fuse's introduction to ground combat, he makes one specific exception. The VT fuse, he writes, has won the Battle of the Bulge. And once every army possesses this technology, existing infantry tactics built around taking cover from artillery will need to be entirely reinvented. Layer this on top of everything already in place. The Garand rate of fire, reconnaissance by fire, time on target, forward observers at platoon level with radios in their hands, the German rifleman in his oak leaf smock, the technical culmination of 15 years of camouflage research, is now facing an army whose theory of finding him does not require finding him at all. Only knowing with reasonable confidence that he is somewhere inside a defined area, and then delivering enough fire into that area that the distinction stops mattering. The Army's own compilation of German prisoner statements from the summer of 1944 contains a section that intelligence officers titled, "Without Apparent Irony." Enemy comments on American methods. The entries beneath it come from interrogation conducted across units that had no contact with each other and no shared chain of command. The same four words recur, translated slightly differently by different clerks, in report after report. We could not locate them. These were not unintelligent men. They were veterans. They understood, in the specific way experienced soldiers understand their own survival, what should and should not get them killed. Their training held that detection precedes death as an absolute rule. When they could not be detected, they should not have died. Otto Schick survives the war. The Munich art professor who spent years studying how sunlight falls through oak leaves continues to work in textile and pattern design afterward. His patterns in modified forms will influence camouflage development for decades. The Bundeswehr will adopt derivatives of his work. Elements of his research will migrate into camouflage doctrine adopted by other NATO militaries once the war's lessons have been fully absorbed. His camouflage was not a failed technology. It was a brilliant solution to a problem the United States Army in Normandy had simply declined to pose. The German theory of combat was deterministic. If undetected, then unharmed, it was internally coherent. It was mathematically clean. It matched every rule the men wearing the smocks had ever been taught. And it matched exactly the war the British were fighting on the same ground at the same time. The American theory was probabilistic. Detection was never guaranteed. So the system was built to make that uncertainty survivable through sufficient density of fire, delivered from far enough away that the shooter never needed to see the man he killed. Both theories were coherent. Only one of them matched the conditions actually present in the Bocage in the summer of 1944. The paratrooper east of Saint-Lô, the one who had not moved in 6 hours, the one whose comrade would tell an American intelligence officer that they were not seen, was the technical inheritor of everything German camouflage research had ever produced. He was, by any neutral measurement, nearly impossible to see. The mortar that killed him did not need to see him. It needed only a grid coordinate that probably contained a hedge, that probably contained someone, and a willingness to saturate that coordinate, regardless of whether the someone had ever been confirmed. He died without understanding what had killed him, because the framework he had trained inside did not contain the possibility of dying unseen. Somewhere in Munich, a professor of textile design was still alive. Somewhere in Oklahoma, the gun line that Carlos Brewer had spent his career imagining was still firing. And somewhere in the Bocage, in a hedgerow that had grown wild since the Romans, a young man in a beautifully printed cotton smock lay in a position no eye had ever found. He had done everything right. He had died anyway. And the war moved past him into a new century of soldiering in which the question that killed him would never again be the wrong question to ask.